First of all, I request everyone to mute. Okay. Okay. So good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome back. Uh, Again, I'm thrilled to have you join for episode 6 of our series. First, I would like to thank you for your engagement and support we have received till episode 6. Sorry, episode 5. Yeah. And it was a great success, and it wouldn't have been possible without your participation and enthusiasm. Now, as we begin today's session, please note that this episode is being recorded, and by continuing to participate, you are providing your verbal consent to be part of this recorded session. This recording request has been raised by many of our fellows, okay, um, in the group, and that's the reason means I have decided that we'll record the session. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Okay, if you give me 1 second, I want, yeah, whose name is Mr. Mohammed Talib. He is a partner at Pinsent Mason based in Hong Kong and a solicitor advocate with expertise in construction projects across the Middle East. His practice spans contentious matter across building and civil engineering projects, representing employer, main contractor, and subcontractor in dispute in the courts and in arbitration. And today he is going to share his experience, also which he has gained in his recent arbitration experience on the topic of making and defending disruption claims, a lesson learned from a recent arbitration case. So let's get started. And Mr. Talib, the platform is over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today and to share with you some of the experiences we have had and hopefully some of the things that you may consider if you are ever facing a situation where you need to deal with a disruption claim. So my goal today is to avoid being too theoretical, avoid being too abstract, but I am a lawyer, so I will talk a little bit about contract clauses and law and the way these things are used in a claim, and then tie that together with some recent practical experience I've had where we've been making and defending a very large and complex disruption claim. So what I would hope to do today is to take you through kind of 7 stages. Stage 1 is to just very quickly refresh all of us on what disruption is and what it looks like. Then to look at some of the contractual mechanisms by which liability for a disruptive event can be pinned on the employer or pinned on the person who has caused the disruption to you so that you can look to recover it. We'll talk a little bit about some of the very fundamental and difficult challenges that come out of trying to quantify the amount of disruption that you've encountered. And then we will look at the difficult problem of causation, because the real challenge with disruption claims is often to take the problems that have happened on site and tie that into money and tie the money into allocation of responsibility. So causation is the bridge across which that is done, and causation is the thing that causes the main problem for disruption claims. So we'll talk a little bit about causation. I'll talk to you a little bit about the kind of records that you need to measure productivity and to give you some ideas based on a claim that I was involved with, what kind of records we use to record productivity in a way that helps substantiate the claim. And then I'll take you through that case study that we've been talking about, which is looking at that recent arbitration to draw out some of the lessons learned. And then the part I'm looking forward to, which is the chance to interact with all of you, to hear some of your questions and your own expertise and insight into these issues, and see how we can all learn from each other. So without much further ado, I will just jump straight into the first question. What is disruption? The classic definition of disruption, every time anybody ever talks about disruption, we end up starting with the SCL protocol. The SCL delay and disruption protocol is usually a reasonable starting point for any disruption claim. I want to just deal with some of the quick myths The delay and disruption protocol is not law. It's not binding. It may not be relevant to your contract precisely. It may not reflect the expectations of you or your contractors or your subcontractors or your suppliers or your employer. But nonetheless, I think most experts will agree that it reflects a very reliable codified body of opinion. So it's a good place to start. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about disruption? The first thing I want to take from this definition is disruption, brackets, as distinct from delay. There is a tendency, I call it the first myth of disruption claims, to think that disruption and delay are somehow connected together. There's no reason for them to be connected in that way. Disruption claims are not critical path events, and they don't really matter whether the events that they are dealing with are critical path events or not. So whether or not the disrupted activity is delaying really doesn't matter. What matters is you're looking at what happened to the ordinary work that is being done by the contractor. Is there some disturbance, hindrance, or inefficiency that is affecting the contractor's normal working methods? Is something happening to the contractor on site that is interrupting what it is normally doing? And the consequence of that is that the contractor is working less efficiently, less effectively than it normally would. You are looking at ordinary activities that are being carried out on the job, and you are seeing, oh, what would normally be done in a day is taking a day and a half. We are working less effectively, less productively than we had planned. So the key here is that the disruption has to bring the productivity lower than what is planned or possible. So these are going to be important elements when we look at how you base and define and defend a disruption claim, because you're going to really look very carefully at what is planned or what is possible on the site. And then if you can show that there has been that impact, what you can recover from that loss of productivity is the effect that the slower rate of progress, the slower rate of productivity had on the costs you incurred in carrying out the work. So that's some of the key elements that we can take away from this very useful starting point in the definition of what is a disruption claim. And those are some of the things and some of the themes that we will come back to again and again across the next about 40 minutes as we look at this in a little bit more detail. The first thing we have to bear in mind is we are looking at external caused interruption to the contractor. Something is happening due to the employer or due to the person up the supply chain that is affecting the productivity of the contractor. Now, we know that there can be a lot of internal reasons, and you've got some of those demonstrated for you on the slide, why things are not going as fast as they should be. This chart builds together some of the most commonly identified reasons for lack of productivity in the industry. Lack of qualified and skilled labor, bad planning, poor communication, poor teamwork, and bad site logistics. All of those matters are internal to the contractor. If the reason you are experiencing poor productivity falls into those categories, you're unlikely to have any basis by which you can make a claim. And these are often important factors because when you are making a disruption claim, the first allegation you will get back from any employer or from any main contractor is it's got nothing to do with what I'm doing. It's all about these sorts of factors. It's about your poor site coordination, your poor logistics, your learning curve on site, your inexperienced team. And those are the real reasons for low productivity. But as the person making a claim, you may well be focused on the things in black on the slide. You will be saying, no, the reason I'm struggling on site and the reason things are taking much longer than I expected is bad drawing. Bad design is one of the major causes of disruption claims. But they can equally be factors such as schedule changes, bad management of interfaces by a general contractor, inefficiencies created by variations on site, or interfacing with other trades. There may be all sorts of parallel factors that are going on that are ultimately visible in poor productivity. So there's a challenge here, which is inherent in this slide, which is unpicking between internal and external productivity challenges. Okay, moving on to the next slide. When you are looking to make a claim for disruption, or when you are put in a position where you notice on site things are not going as efficiently as I had planned, what is actually going on? Well, these are the sorts of circumstances that are the usual reasons why somebody is bringing a disruption claim. It's usually due to frequent, repetitive, complicated design changes that are having impacts on the site and can be seen repeatedly. Each one of them individually might be a variation or it might not be. There might be provisions for you to claim for late release of design and all that sort of thing. But it's the cumulative impact that can often be the heart of a disruption claim. Similarly, late or incomplete information, where you're waiting for information from the employer, from interfacing contractors, or from others on site, and you're not getting that information, or it's coming out late or slowly in dribs and drabs, and you're only getting, 100 meters of concrete run at a time for you to start doing your work. And then you get to the end of that and you have to wait until the next bit of information comes out. That's often the situation where you should be thinking about a disruption claim. Similarly, where you're getting restricted or piecemeal site access, you're being given this 100 meters of concrete for you to carry out today. I don't know when you can do the next 100 meters of concreting. Come back tomorrow. I'll tell you whether you can do it or not. Those are the sorts of situations where people will find that their productivity is just not what they expect. Similarly, interfacing with other contractors, out of sequence working can be major reasons for this sort of delay and disruption. And last but not least, underrated, because usually people don't spot it when it happens, but acceleration can often be a significant reason for disruption. And often people bring acceleration claims saying, well, look, these are all the additional resources that I've had to bring on site to get the job done. But what they miss is the knock-on impact of having all of those additional resources on their normal work and the ordinary crew and their expected productivity. Because one of the things we know about disruption claims is they are very prone to domino effects. Once you start being disrupted, disruptions tend to cascade across the site and they tend to spread across into different trades, different interfaces, even into different suppliers and subcontractors. Because things like crowding on site naturally start to follow. The bit of site you need to work on is not available because 3 other people are trying to work there at the same time. Your labor is idling because there are handover periods or periods where they are waiting for someone to finish work that is ahead of them in the sequence. There can be significant impacts on machinery, which is being used in either substantial idling or because they are suffering disruption in their use due to extra downtime, breakdowns, additional preventative maintenance. All these sorts of things can start adding up and creating disruption. And alongside that, what we frequently see in disruption claims is there's a loss of supervision. There are often more people doing things on site in challenging ways or out of sequence ways or unexpected ways, and site supervisions just cannot cope with the amount of different unexpected things that are going on. And there is a resultant risk increase when it comes to things like health and safety or suspensions because of health and safety. And all of these sort of risks start kind of building a snowball effect, which starts really disrupting the productivity on site. So you have to look for your causes, but you also have to look for the knock-on domino effect of these disruptive events and their cascading effect on productivity on site. Now, it is absolutely clear when you start looking at liability for disruptive events that the disruptive events must be the responsibility of the employer or the person who's above you in the supply chain, the main contractor, and so on. But the challenge really is that disruption is usually not even a basis of claim under the contract. Very few contracts deal with disruption in any sort of constructive way, recognizing it as a potential impact on the contractor that requires some regard to an assessment of additional cost. It's usually just not dealt with. What people do in practice is they may sweep up some of these effects when you are looking to deal with connected claim heads. So if you have a series of drawings being issued, you may be looking at if you're on the FIDIC Red Book, saying, well, I can make claims for delayed drawings. If there are being changes instructed out of sequence or at late periods, you may be saying, well, look, I'll sweep that up in the variations valuation, or I'll make it as part of my site access claim if I'm being denied site access. The problem is with these piecemeal approaches to claim, what often gets valued and often gets paid is, for example, if it's a remeasurable contract, the ordinary rates, or the normal lump sums, or the star rates that adjust for the change in circumstances. But what they often fail to pick up is the change in working environment, or the change in work continuity, or the change in work sequence that needs to be also valued if you want to successfully recover the disruption costs that you're encountering. So often where you are in disruption situations and you rely on the contractual basis, actually variations, site access claims are making an under recovery. You are actually giving a further discount for your disrupted productivity and only recovering your direct costs. And this can be a real challenge when the scale of disruption is significant and we have those cascading effects that I talked about earlier. The reality is far from giving an entitlement to claim for disruption. Modern contracts are more interested in finding a way to carve out disruption claims. There may be extensive contractual blocking provisions that are put in place to ensure that no disruption claim can be made. They can be quite innocent looking. You may not even realize that they're there to impact your ability to make a disruption claim, but they do have this impact. You might be required to work to the employer's program, including any changes to the program, and that will sweep up changes to site access, changes to sequence, changes to working methods and methodologies that might be implied in changes to those sequences, etc. So all of these sort of things can start having disruption waiving effects. You may be required to coordinate with others, give them access to carry out interfacing work, and you might be even required to let the employer resolve any disputes between the two of you about who gets priority to complete their work. And often when these sorts of provisions exist, they will come with a waiver in relation to claims for all sorts of reasons, including for disruption. So you will have no entitlement, no basis to recover. You might have restrictions in your contract on complying with improperly given instructions. So you have a variation that's not been instructed through the formal variations methodology. You went ahead and did the right thing and did the job, but you're not going to recover for that either as a variation, and you're certainly going to recover any consequential events of that variation, which will sweep up your disruption claim. There may be also very broad language to sweep up any actions of the contractor that might actually relate to its own actions or its own poor performance. So, for example, it might be very common to say, well, you won't recover additional time for concurrent delay, but it might also go on to say you won't recover any costs, including any disruption costs or any other indirect costs that you may encounter. And so no matter what else is going on, these sorts of blocking provisions are put in place by sophisticated employers just to ensure that none of the losses that flow from disruption can be recovered. And if you can't recover any of the losses, then there's no point in bringing a claim, is there? And their goal is to prevent these sorts of claims, often because they see them as too remote, too indirect, or things that they don't have easy ability to see on site and address through proactive project management. So shift all of these risks to the contractor, make sure that they manage them, and if they don't manage them well, they're on the hook for those costs. I'd like to move on now to look at how you can quantify the disruption. If you're on a project, you're encountering disruption, and you are seeing that, look, I can see that these sorts of causes are happening, and I need to now put in place some sort of method that will help me protect my position in respect of this claim. Because I need to think about how I'm going to put in this claim. I'm going to put in my notice, I'm going to put in my particulars, for sure. But what am I going to be saying in those particulars about how much productivity have I lost? And so, again, it's a very good starting point, the SCL protocol, because it sets out a number of methods that you can use to quantify the loss of productivity. Broadly, you can divide the ways that you can quantify the loss into two halves. There are productivity-based methods and there are cost-based methods. In general, the productivity-based methods are much more preferable when it comes to quantifying disruption. Productivity-based methods look at either the specific project and they look at specific disrupted activities to see what has been the loss of productivity, or they try and generalize by looking at other projects that might be relevant and comparable, or by looking more broadly at the trade to see what is comparable. On the other hand, we have cost-based methods of quantifying productivity. Cost-based methods of productivity take a much cruder approximation of the effects and say, look, I should have spent 100 dirham to do this work. I actually incurred total cost of 150 dirham to do this work. And I think the loss is a loss of productivity. So those 50 dirham that I'm talking about that are extra, those are all actually additional loss of productivity related costs. A more sophisticated version of that is to look at the estimated versus incurred labor costs and say, well, look, I didn't deploy any extra plant and I didn't deploy any extra materials to do the job. But what I did is I put on additional people. And so I quantified the additional people element of my estimated costs and my incurred costs. And if you have the records that allow you to break that down and you have the site records that help you quantify the additional people that you've got, then you can use this method to work out your extra labor costs. And you say, the extra labor costs that I incurred are my recovery for loss of productivity. But these are broadly the two big schools. Now, when it comes to look at the project-based methodologies, the gold standard is what's called the measured mile. The measured mile benefits from being widely accepted. It benefits from using actual project data, so you don't need to speculate about what productivity would be achieved. It's very effective when it comes to repetitive activities, and it eliminates most of the arguments about contractor performance. So how does it work? A based method of carrying out a measured mile is to go through the project, find out where you did the disrupted activity, find an equivalent part of the project where you weren't disrupted by the disrupting event, and measure your productivity carrying out that activity. So if you were doing 100 meters of ducting, you say, well, here's the part where I was doing the 100 meters of ducting and I didn't have the design, or the designs were a big issue to me, piecemeal, step by step. And you can see how productive I was. And here's a part of the project where I had 100 meters of design to do the ductworks, and look how fast I could do the ductworks there. And the difference between those two rates of productivity is my measured mile, claim for loss of productivity. So because the measured mile tells you how fast I can normally work, you can now see how fast I was actually able to work when I was disrupted, and you give me the benefit of the difference. In reality, the challenge, the cons for a measured mile, is it's quite document intensive. You have to have the records that will support productivity rates across the periods of disruption and undisrupted working. It can tend to be quite complex because smart engineers and sophisticated project managers can find lots of reasons to say particular bits of work are not comparable to each other. They will say, well, when you were doing the first bit of ducting, there was a nice sunny period. So your undisrupted ducting was done, in really great conditions. So of course you shouldn't be surprised that you were making really good productivity. But that extra bit of disrupted productivity that you're talking about, oh, but that was in Ramadan. That was when we had restrictions on labor anyway. It had nothing to do with the design. It had to do with all these sorts of other factors that you would need to take into account when looking at your disruption claim. And so one of the challenges actually for the measured mile approach is it requires you to find this period of unimpacted productivity. But where you have significant disruption claims, you might have no place and no time in the contract where you are truly working as good, as fast, as carefully, and as carefully as you normally would. You've just been disrupted everywhere in some form or another. So you can't go away and isolate this period of good productivity. Similarly, you might not be able to find a period where there was no there was nothing but the employer's fault that was affecting your productivity. So even in your impacted period, there may be all sorts of related costs. There may be internal factors of productivity involved, such as learning curves or efficiency or site communications that are also at play. And so you can't use the measured mile to help you quantify the loss of productivity that you suffered. And so the real question you need to be asking yourself whenever you're going to be using a measured mile approach is, can I find something where there is sufficient similarity between the measured work and the disrupted work? And on very high disruption projects, the problem is the answer is often no. You can't. You can't find that sort of comparator that allows me to justify my claim. Now, that doesn't mean we give up and say, well, I can't bring a disruption claim. There are alternative methods of quantifying disruption. But this is where it starts to get complicated. And this is where you need to start thinking very carefully about what records you've got, how you tendered for the job, what can I say about the productivities that I've assumed and planned for, and how can I use those as a comparison with the actual productivities that I've encountered on site. What you fall back on where you can't carry out a measured mile is on something called the earned value analysis. Very crudely, it can be described as something that measures what was earned, what was versus what was burned to carry out the job. So you look at the man hours that you've got in the tender allowance for completing the work that you say was disrupted. And you compare that with the man hours you actually incurred to carry out the work. And there are various metrics you can use to assess how much you have planned for versus how much you have incurred. So you can see there the definitions of earned value and actual cost. I'm not going to go into those. But what you look at is either the cost variance. So is the amount I've earned more or less than the actual cost I've incurred? Of course, if it's less, then there's a cost overrun and I've got something to claim for. And you need to look at what is the extent of productivity that you've lost. But as a crude approximation, just subtracting EV minus AC will give you an idea that there's a cost overrun and there's lower than expected productivity. If you want to refine that calculation a bit further, you can actually look at how much disruption you've incurred by using EV divided by AC. So you take the earned value and you divide it by the actual cost, and it gives you a productivity factor. You are looking at that to say, well, look, if I'm below 1, I am working inefficiently because I'm paying more for actual cost labor hours than I'm earning back from the bill of quantities or for the tendered rates or whatever it is you might be looking to look at your earned value from. And that will give you an idea, because as it varies, it will tell you how disrupted you are. Generally, if you are running at an efficiency factor over 1, though, it's very difficult to bring a claim on this basis because it will look like you are recovering even though your tender productivity is already being exceeded. You're more productive on site than you plan to be at tender, and so there shouldn't really be any justification for you to claim. You may feel that there is still a justification for you to claim because actually I had planned for 10 meters cubed a day at tender. On site, my team is good, they work hard, they're capable of delivering 15 meters cubed a day. And the only reason we're doing 11 meters cubed a day is because the employer is getting in my way. But if you're looking at an EVA-based sort of approach, it seems to suggest you are not entitled to recover if you're using this sort of analysis. So you do have to think carefully about how you use the analysis, how you generate the substantiation, where the disruptions are coming from, if you're going to make an EVA-based analysis work. There are something that can be the major points of contention. If you bring a claim for disruption based on an earned value analysis, I guarantee you the employer will be very, very anxious to talk to you about your tender. They will want to know everything about your planned productivity. They will look carefully at what do you show in terms of durations, what breakdowns do you have for your schedule of rates or for your bill of quantities that will help me understand exactly what productivities you had planned. Do you have details that show me how much labor, plant, material you had allocated across different parts? And if you do, can you show me that these have been calculated properly and they are realistic and achievable? There'll be a very rigorous assessment of how you've put these numbers together. But an EVA is a widely accepted method. It can be used in practice. It is used successfully. But if you're going to use it, you need some very good records. You need to think very carefully about what it shows because it doesn't identify the causes of the loss. It just shows you that there's a loss of productivity. The measured mile potentially allowed you to allocate and identify causes. An EVA can only tell you that things are going badly. And you will then have this argument about whose fault that is. Is it the contractor's fault or is it the employer's fault? There are other methods that you can use to quantify. We've talked about the cost-based approaches, but there are also authorities, commentaries that support an argument that you can assess on the basis of what they call work or trade sampling. This is an observational study done on time, on the site, looking at what's going on and saying, on this day, concrete team one didn't work because they didn't have access to the site because another person was working there. Today, these people idle. Today, these people were working inefficiently. Those people had to be reallocated from building one to building two. It's very observational. It's very direct. And it invites you to draw inferences about productivity from what is recorded and what is seen. But if you're going to do this, you have to be very thorough. And you have to be very specific in either your site diaries, your site records, or in compiling these sorts of observations later and pulling it into correspondence and putting it into claims, really, that stand up and show the detail that supports the disruption events and the disruptive causation. There is some argument in common law jurisdictions for what is called the Cleveland Bridge approach. This is a chance for the tribunal to say, look, we don't expect human beings to be perfect. We recognize that it's about the balance of probabilities. And if on the balance of probabilities, you can show me there was a 51% chance that this is the productivity and this is the disruptions, they're probably connected and I can make an assessment of the productivity impact that you suffered. So there's some latitude for tribunals. And I think even in civil law jurisdictions, there is some latitude when it comes to the use of causation and thinking about how disruption and costs and productivity tie together for a tribunal to make an assessment as to what the causation impact is. Okay, you work out what the disrupting events are, you work out what the productivity loss is, you have to do some hand waving to turn that into money. And so there are two major approaches that you can take in order to make such a claim and to make it work. One, if you're using something that allows you to use rates, you can look at adjustments to the rates. So it's a re-rating exercise to say, well, the labor component of that rate should have been X. Because of the disruption, labor has gone up to X plus 2. I now re-rate the whole element, whole rate, adjusting for the actual labor that was required, and I got a new rate for labor in the disrupted situation. And you put that to use. If you're not able to re-rate with the planned or measured production levels, then you will have to look at how you can otherwise quantify the additional cost and make it as some form of cost claim, looking at salaries or hourly compensation for labor, overhead, supervision costs, profit elements, whatever else you might want to add on top of your additional costs, and to reflect your indirect costs to capture the full extent and the full quantification of disruption. And one of the things you'll need to think about carefully in both situations is mitigation. So you will need to think, well, not only what did I do to minimize the effect of the disruption? Did I move people to additional or open or available work fronts? Did I get people to work on things that were possible to progress even if there was not the perfect, efficient working? Or did I let people stand around and do nothing at all? Because all of these things are going to affect the quantification of your disruption claim, because some adjustment will be made by either tribunal or by an engineer when valuing your claim to say, well, what is the disruptive consequences and how do you account for it as part of the disruptive events? Okay, so the tricky thing here is then causation. The problem with causation is the scenarios that are talked about in the literature and what people think about when they give you things like the measured mile is that there is one employer responsibility disruptive event that has a knock-on effect here. This is the particular bit of concreting that was affected by that lack of design, and therefore I can assess the causal link. The problem is disruption never happens like that in practice. Disruption in practice always has that domino effect that I was talking about, and it often happens across multiple causes. So there'll be multiple drawings and multiple site access issues and multiple interfacing risks that you are forcing to deal with at the same time. And it's impossible to unentangle and show these are the employer's risk events and these are the contractor's risk events. In theory, that's what you're meant to do. You're meant to go back and say, these are the things that the employer is responsible for. This is a loss of productivity caused by them. This is therefore my additional entitlement to payment. But what you can do in reality is to try and exclude as much as possible. So try and subtract as many overlapping disruptive events and try and subtract as many contractor risk events as you can, or show that as part of your tender, you made some reasonable allowance for those activities. So you will say to the tribunal or the engineer, look, I'm an experienced contractor. I know how to get on and do concreting work. I know when I'm doing concreting that all sorts of things can happen, including learning curves and the occasional bit of disruption. And so when I planned this job, I allowed for all of that. Any additional impact that I'm seeing that is above and beyond what I planned for is your fault, not my fault. And it's the productivity that I'm entitled to recover for as part of the valuation of my claim. If you're really going to do this to a high standard with a high level of rigor, you're going to need a lot of records. You're going to be needing to keep them carefully and contemporaneously. You're going to need to analyze them carefully. You're going to have to think carefully about what's a cause and what's an effect. And you're going to have to think carefully about whose cause and whose effect. They are usually going to be matters that straddle both technical site issues, construction issues, engineering issues, and also legal and contractual issues in tying this cause to those effects. And it's often tempting when you're facing these claims to say, all of this is a bit too hard and I don't really want to do it. Can't I just put in a claim that's a global one? A global claim is one that takes all of the disruption events and says, look, I can't unpick all of them and allocate some of them to the contractor and some of them to the employer and work out which ones I can recover for and which ones I can't recover for. Can I just put in the whole bunch? And there is case law in the common law world that says, yes, you can if you're really allowed to do so, but it's got to be specifically justified in the situation that you're in. The circumstances have to justify it. So they are looking for things like the disruptions are so interrelated that separating out individual effects is impossible or impractical. And the documentation is simply not good enough to allow that sort of assessment to happen. But the reality is that, at least in my experience, engineers are absolutely uninterested in global claims. They certainly don't want to be assessing and giving any quantum of recovery in relation to them. But tribunals and courts can be a little bit more forgiving because they recognize that it's a practical, difficult challenge that has to be faced down and that has to be dealt with. Okay, I'll quickly move through records. I'm mindful of time and I'm very keen to share the case study with you for 5 or 10 minutes. But records are vital for a disruption claim. I think from everything I've said already, you can see that you must have good maintain good records. And the failure to maintain records is going to make it very hard to justify your claim, and it's going to make it very hard to justify a global claim. Many contractual clauses nowadays will require the contractor to keep adequate records and will allow the engineer to specify that additional records should be kept. So they have this double ability to say, well, if you're going to be making a disruption claim, please go off and make sure you have the relevant records. But anyway, it's your responsibility to make sure you keep sufficient records in place. This is a slide I will just share with you. It's an example of a project that I was involved with where we were dealing with a TBM progress claim, and there were issues in relation to disruption. Disruption was caused by changes in design, but also by the unexpected geological conditions that we encountered. And therefore, to set up a disruption claim, we had to differentiate between at least these two major issues. And so we kept very, very detailed records, started to be kept as this TBM went down to make sure that we were getting all the data that would allow us to make nuanced allocation between design and ground conditions when it came to our two claims. And you can see the list there. I'm not going to read that list out to you, but you can imagine that that level of claiming requires that level of substantiation to be kept in place every shift. These kind of details had to be recorded if this claim was going to succeed. Okay, so in 10 minutes, I'm going to take you through this case study of a disruption claim on a major project that we have just finished the arbitration in relation to. So pretty far down the supply chain, a claim by a subcontractor to a subcontractor on a railway project in Qatar. Very substantial project, $700 million real contract. The contract contained a pretty clear disclaimer to the claimant that this was going to be a problematic job. So it says in the special conditions, we're going to be doing design and construction at the same time. Major buildings are not going to be ready for you. You're going to have to proceed diligently and without any claim. You have no entitlements. Delay, disruption, whatever it is you want to recover, sorry, you're not allowed. And by the way, because of this situation that we find ourselves in, everybody else, every other subcontractor has the exact same conditions in their contract. So you're all taking on the risk in relation to sequence, site access, interfacing, coordination. You're all going to have to work with each other and sort these things out. What the respondent subcontractor was absolutely not interested in is any claims. So there were not going to be any claims made to the subcontractor about this stuff. It wasn't interested. All of these matters had to be the problem of and the responsibility of and ultimately the burden of the claimant. Lucky for the claimant, midway through this project, there were some major acceleration measures required. And in order for the claimant to take on the acceleration works, it said, no, I want a supplemental agreement to be entered into. And so it entered into this supplemental agreement. As a result of the supplemental agreement, it put in its claim for disruption and acceleration for 200 million Qatari riyal in relation to a plethora of design-based claims. Late design, out-of-sequence design, ever-changing design, work stoppages, you name it, we're claiming for it. A very substantial claim. And primarily a claim that it was able to bring because it had this supplemental agreement. It would have struggled a lot under the contract, but it did bring a number of claims under the contract, and maybe some of these provisions will be useful to you. It claimed under the variation provision. It claimed for breach of contract, especially in relation to the duty to execute the contract works in accordance with general good practice, and to do so in a manner compatible with the proper execution of the subcontract. It said, if you keep issuing design, and if you keep issuing changing design, that's bad engineering. That's bad construction management. That's not good practice, and it's a breach of the duty to act in that way. So I can make my disruption claim on this basis. And every time you had me suspend because you issued design late, I can recover those under the suspension provisions. And I can recover the consequences of suspension as I came back on site, as I ramped up again, and I was disrupted and lost productivity as the consequences of those suspensions. So it doesn't matter what exclusions you have. I have these express entitlements under the contract that allow me to claim for disruption, and they're sufficient for me to evade your exclusions in the contract. But even better, it had the memorandum of agreement. And you can see some of the language that was put in there. It was just put into the preamble. It's not the operative provisions. It's not binding. It's not operative in the sense that they give rise to concrete entitlements. But it tells the story and the situation that the parties were in. It tells you that there have been delays to the drawing. There have been problems. Yes, the main contract remains unchanged, but I'm going to be entitled to be reimbursed on a fair and reasonable basis for disruption costs. And so I can put in a claim for that and it will be payable. These are the opportunities that you will need to look for when you're coming into deal with a disruption claim, because it's not easy contractually otherwise. You need to look very carefully at what was said when you were drafting the contract. the history of the clauses and the negotiation of them to see, well, what was actually said about disruption type claims? Why was certain language put in? What did we know about at the time? But the reality is in this arbitration, the drafting history and the memorandum of agreement is what convinced the tribunal that there was a common intention of the parties to allow disruption claims to come. So even though when you look at the contract and you see all of these excluding language, you think, oh, this is a very difficult claim to make. Once you start to dig deeper, once you look one level underneath, you can see, oh, there's actually a strong basis of claim here. I know time bar provisions are always of interest, but in the interest of time, I think you will have the slides. I'm very happy to share them with you. You can look at the parts in relation to time bar provisions, but I'll skip over that now, and exclusion clauses as well. But I'll talk a little bit about the methodology because that's the interesting part as well as the causation part. So right at the outset on this project, when we got the experts engaged to look at the disruption that was suffered, both of them said, look, we can't find a single instance in this project where either side accepts there was undisrupted opportunity to work on the job. I mean, the special conditions, like I showed you, said there's going to be piecemeal design from day one. And that's exactly what happened. Both experts said, look, we'll try and do an earned value analysis. The claimant's expert did a very traditional earned value analysis. Break it down month by month. In every month, look at the actual quantities of work carried out. For each actual quantity of work carried out, look at the tender, work out the man-hour components of each of those items, look how much labor was therefore tendered for, and then also do the same calculation for how much labor was actually used on site, and you can see the difference. Classic earned value analysis, earned versus burned resourcing. The respondent's expert tried to be a bit cleverer. They said, well, look, what we can do is sort of do an EVA, but I think there are portions of this project which are maybe not perfect for a measured mile analysis, but they are relatively undisturbed. So I can do a sort of measured mile analysis and say there are good illustrations of what could have been achieved by the contractor. And their analysis actually said, well, if you look at those minimally disrupted periods, they are quite comparable with the actually disrupted periods. And if you look at what the events are said to be and the periods of productivity, there's just no connection. Times when they say they disrupted, they were actually doing really well in terms of productivity. Times when productivity was very bad, they don't make any claims for disruption. So the respondent's expert said this claim should fail. The claimant's view was preferred. Tribunal said, I'd rather accept a methodology that has been done properly and was done effectively, even if it wasn't done perfectly. I'm very happy to accept that this sort of analysis can be sustained. But in order to make those findings, the tribunal really did benefit from some very good record keeping by the claimants. They had excellent records of their tender productivities. This particular contractor gave evidence to say that, well, for every tender, we draw our productivities from a standardized database. We update the standardized database every 6 months. Every 6 months, we benchmark all of our projects against those productivities, and that's how we tender. We are experienced, in Qatar. We have been working there for decades. We know what can realistically be achieved. We are quite satisfied that what we put into the tender could be realistically achieved. That kind of evidence was critical to convince the tribunal that the earned value analysis could be relied on. It just made it so much more credible. So, some quick lessons learned. You don't need a perfect methodology. A less than perfect methodology can still help you win if it works with the records that you have and you can fortify it with the evidence that you can bring. You do need strong evidence about tender productivity and assumptions to make an EVA work. And the reality is most contractors are really bad at keeping those types of records. So it's going to be a challenge. And the final point we'll make very quickly is in relation to causation. So the claimant was very frank. They said this is a global claim. Disruptive events were happening every day, all the way across the site in multiple locations. There was no way I could deal with this job in the way that anybody would expect a clear causal analysis to be put forward. The disruptive events are so interlinked. that it's impossible to separate them. And worse than that, sometimes disruptive events had this domino effect. So something would happen on Monday and I wouldn't feel the effect until Friday. So the effects weren't always instant. It's not that a disruptive event in January only had an impact in January. The impact might actually be felt in February or in March. And so all of these are good reasons for me to put in a global claim. The respondent said, no, 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 no. It's your job to keep good records. You didn't keep the records. If you don't keep the records, and there are records of disruptive events that are your fault, then the claim fails. Very classical, tough causal analysis. The tribunal was very practical. Yes, we can accept a global claim. It doesn't matter if you can identify every disruptive event, every causal link, every little bit of lost productivity. What matters is, can you do it for some of them? And in this case, the contractor was able to do it for some of them. It was able to show illustrative examples of where there was a productivity claim. And the tribunal said, yes, that's it, that's enough. Because ultimately, causation is about common sense. And if you can make the story make sense, tribunals have a lot of freedom to determine how causation works. So, the overall outcome. The tribunal accepted that the majority of events causing disruption were the respondent's fault, the design issues, the interfacing issues, the stoppages. But it said, well, look, the claim is global, not on an event by event basis. I need to make some assessment of the causation. And this is where the claimant will probably look back at this arbitration and think, I'm not sure this was a success at all because I made a disruption claim. The tribunal validated my methodology. It allowed me to recover the quantum, but it only gave me 5.57 million. I came into this arbitration claiming 200 million Qatari riyal, and I recovered 2.67% of it. And that's perhaps one of the most challenging lessons you can take away from a disruption claim, is it's even when your method works, even when your analysis is good, even when you make a global claim and you jump over the hoop and the tribunal admits it, there's still this difficulty when it comes to quantification. And quantification tends to turn on impression and discretion. And you can see that the tribunal was just not comfortable here in making the broad sort of assessment that the claimant needed for its claim to succeed. And so it's one of those cases where you can look back and say, well, if I'm the claimant, I succeeded, but at what cost? And in the respondent, you'll say, I lost, but maybe I can live with this kind of defeat. And it really does illustrate the big problems when it comes to disruption claims. Okay, so some of the key takeaways from this presentation are there on the slide. I know I'm running a bit over time, so I won't spend any time going through them, but think very carefully about your disruption claims, the events that you rely on, the records that you have, and the way you bring those records together. And if you can do that, you do have a chance of bringing an effective and valid disruption claim. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Talib. If anyone has any questions, they can put it in the chat. I have some, 2, 3 questions which I figured it out. I noticed from myself. So the one which you mentioned, Mr. Talib, that we have to mention the productivity during the tender. Yeah. Definitely during the tendering process, the contractor may put the productivity which he has in general in common, right? And when it means when he gets appointed, he works in detail during the program itself. Yeah. So definitely there is a deviation from the tender productivity and the program productivity. So during the arbitrations and this process, will that have an impact on the product? I mean, on the loss of the productivity. Which one the arbitration will consider?
Yeah, so I mean, it was definitely a live issue for us in the arbitration. So there were two kind of windows that were being looked at. The first window that was being looked at is the actual tender productivity. So literally take the BQ and try and disassemble the rates and say what's the labor component, what's how many man hours are planned for each particular activity, say relevant to constructing this duct bank.
Oh,
And to be fair, this contractor had those records and it had kept them. for this project. Like it could show that this is actually, and you can sort of tie the numbers in. But even then, there were always arguments about, well, look, we asked you for a discount, you gave us a discount. How do we factor the discount into your tender productivities now?
Ah,
You know, there were changes to the design of some works. So how should we adjust the rates for the things that were redesigned? So, they became simpler or they became more complicated, and people will have different views on that. So there was that kind of set of arguments. And then there was a separate set of arguments about the first contractors program. So once we had the first contractors program, we could look at the durations of activities and sort of back reverse expected productivities. It wasn't a resource program, but there was enough information from other contemporaneous records to work out anticipated resourcing from method statements, from some aspects of the works and site photographs. We could kind of see, well, how many people are doing this excavation work for the foundations. And all of that also created its own productivity calculations. And they differed quite substantially. There was about a 20-something% variance between the two.
ah,
And the tribunal in this case actually said, look, we're not actually interested in the post-contractual program.
okay.
We're going to go back and look at the tender only because
Yeah.
the tender is where the money comes from. That's what they've priced for. If they put in the first program something more optimistic or less optimistic, we don't worry about that. It's the tender that matters.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you also touch on the clauses, which is, normally is not mentioned even in the FIDIC. So from your experience, would you suggest either an employer or contractor to have any specific clauses, for the disruption claim?
I would. I know it's almost a wishful thinking for me to suggest it, but I think actually yes. I think it's a major and important claim, and if it's dealt with somewhere in the contract, it does make everybody's life easier. But I think the reality is it's probably never going to show up in a special conditions I ever look at. Um, and often that's why people are trying to make disruption claims as part of variation claims or site access claims, etc. Because claims are so much more acceptable when they're within the contractual framework. Whereas if you're having to make arguments about breach of contract or arguments under the civil code, for example, engineers don't like them, right? So I don't think we'll ever see them. I think it would be good if we had them, but I think there are enough contractual routes for contractors anyway.
Okay, okay. Thank you. We'll take some questions, which is from the Abdul Sakur. He said, delay in design is a delay from employer, right? Not a subcontractor delay. Yeah. Okay. Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, generally, yes. It's a delay from the employer. So the issue here was that certain design risks were actually being pushed down the supply chain. So where there was, say, design of a major building that was being done at the main contractor level, was design and build, but certain ancillary systems were being pushed down to the subcontractor level, and the respondent was the person doing that design. So they didn't have the degree of control that they thought they would have. They thought they were in a position where, look, the main contractor is going to give me the design. I'll do my little bits of design. The claimant here is here to do civil engineering works. They'll come in and do the civil works. It'll be no problem, right? It's concrete and ducts and all that sort of stuff. But they never just got the main designs. And so they were trying to push down their design risk by disclaiming it in the special conditions. That you had to know that there was a design risk going on in the contracts above you in the supply chain. And you as a lower tier supplier, lower tier subcontractor, you just get on with it.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is from Ahmad Jamal. He mentioned some clauses. So he's saying, so for disruption definition, can we call compensation under FIDIC 1.9, 4.12, 8.6, etc. Example of disruption claims. Okay. Yes.
Uh, I, I wouldn't necessarily call them examples of disruption claims. They are the sort of events that can give rise to disruption claims. So a variation can, just be a variation, or late drawings can just be late drawings. And it may not necessarily have disruptive effects. But when you are encountering disruptive effects, often when you go back to trace down the root cause, why am I not working as fast or as effectively as I thought I would be, you will find the sort of events that you've identified there.
Okay. Thank you. His next question is, how can we separate losses caused by a disruption event from the losses caused by the contractor's own poor planning and quantity and sorry and quality? I think he's from the contractor.
I mean, that's the if I can put it that way, the $1 million question. It's always challenging. So that's what the methods try and do. So a measured mile, if you do it in the most pure way, will only isolate the employer's disruptive event, and it will carry out the analysis on that time and that period only to isolate the effect. And then you say, well, look, then it must be because of the employer's event. But reality doesn't work in such neat lines. And so there's ultimately a question of judgment. So you will be relying on an experienced engineer or an experienced quantum expert to come back in and say, look, I can make some allowance for these sorts of contractor-caused disruption events. If you say it's because of a learning curve, well, I know when learning curves occur. Learning curves occur at the beginning of jobs. They don't occur in the middle of jobs. If you say, well, it's a ramp down period, right? We're coming to the last few 100 meters of concreting. So things are starting to become inefficient because there's a ramp down period. But I know when ramp down periods occur, they occur at the end of jobs. So it requires that sort of technical knowledge and experience to disaggregate contractor cause events.
We have a couple of more 2, 3 questions. Is it okay if I will take it because we already crossed the time? I hope.
As long as your audience is happy, I'm happy to.
Okay, perfect. I hope they will be happy. The question is from Adnan. He's saying if unaffected area activity duration is less than planned duration in baseline for that activity, how to define that while comparing unaffected and affected area in measured mile method?
It's a really good question. So I think it reveals one of the challenges of the measured mile approach, but it's also one of the benefits of it. So in theory, on the measured mile, you're only being benchmarked against the actual productivity you achieve on site,
Mm,
because a contractor is free to go faster than it's scheduled if it wants to. So if you are better at your job than you plan to be, you are entitled to the benefit of that, right? You're entitled to work as fast and as efficiently as you can.
mm.
If you're being slowed down, then no matter, even if you are still faster than your planned duration, um, it's still the employer's fault. You should be entitled to recover. And a measured mile will allow you to recover on that basis. The problem with an EVA approach is that the EVA won't allow you to recover on that basis. Because to the EVA's eyes, you're still doing better than you tended for. And if you are doing better than you tended for, then you don't have a claim.
I think you explained that also with that 15, 11, and 10 example. Yeah, it's the same. Okay, thank you. The next one is from Mr. Azim. He's saying EVM is a process where the derivation is from actual progress percentage. Can the employer or engineer or court argue the derivation work progress from the contractor to determine EV at point of time?
It is absolutely done. Um, I have seen EV calculations done using kind of just construction progress S curves. So you take the whole program, collapse it into the S curve, and you use that as the basis of your EV. Now, I'm not advocating that as a method to you. It's of course very crude, it's very simplified, and it loses the nuance of the activities that are being disrupted. But certainly you can use that sort of simplification to at least get a feel of where is the disruption happening and what sort of, was it the foundation activities or was it the superstructure activities that are being disrupted? It helps you get a base kind of differentiation. But if you're going to bring that claim on to the engineer or put it before a tribunal, you'll have to dig a bit deeper.
Yeah, thank you. And now this is the last question from Mr. Yusuf. He's saying that if disruption is not expressly defined in the contract, a similar situation faced in concurrency also will impose constraint or disruption claim. And if so, specifically, when one of the party is not willing to accept definition of SCL protocol.
Uh, so again, a really good question. Yes, there will always be an argument about the definition of disruption. And really what works in those situations is to focus on the events rather than the label. So when you're saying that, it's your late drawings that meant I couldn't start work or that I was only doing half the concreting I was meant to be doing, that's when things start to show the knock-on effects and impacts. Disruption is usually a term that's not going to be defined in the contract. And so you are falling back on kind of industry standard documents like the SCL or what's said in textbooks and in case law and in guidance about what disruption looks like. And I think while it can be contentious with, say, an engineer, I think there are very few engineers in the world who will say, I don't really even know what disruption is. They have a good idea of what it looks like. And certainly by the time you get to a court or a DAB, they know what disruption is. They know what it looks like. And they're very uninterested in these sorts of arguments about semantics and definitions. They want to look at really causation and quantification.
Thank you. So sorry, I have one more questions. Let me take this, then I will stop. So with the question is from Mr. Unni. He's saying with the existence of interface and coordination clauses in the contract, how can we distinguish these obligations efforts from disruption?
Sure. So this was again a very live issue in the arbitration because we had all of those blocking provisions saying you took on all the interfacing coordination risks, and it was your job as the uh, claimant to make sure you managed everything, and anything that happened to you was your responsibility financially. And so this was a very tough situation, but actually the tribunal took a very pragmatic view of it. They said that when you are pricing a tender, you price for the coordination interfacing being carried out as normal. You don't expect it to be done badly or in a difficult situation. You anticipate the normal interfacing and challenges, the normal coordination challenges, carried out by a competent general contractor to supervise, who gets you together and sorts these issues out and gives the instructions in a timely manner. If that's not happening, you're not tied to these clauses either. If you're being asked to do something that's superhuman and unreasonable, then obviously you didn't price for that in your tender. So if the construction of these coordination risks, interfacing risks is put very, very high, tribunals say, I'm not buying it.
Thank you. That's all from the chat. If anyone would like to ask any questions, please, they are free. You can unmute yourself and ask. No? Okay, so I will take it that as end of our session. Now, a big thank you to Mr. Talib for coming and to have such an engaging session on disruption claims. Definitely, it's a very complex topic. Okay, itself. Being as an engineer, we ourselves know that how complicated topic it is, how complex it is, and how tedious process the records which we have to kept it. And over that, from in over the theoretical, you added your the practical experience that is very difficult for us, basically to understand in a theoretical way itself. But by adding those practical things, and over that, you mentioned the case where the contractor has raised 200 million and he got only 5.57, which is very 2.67 success rate is really very less. But despite that, definitely a contractor should keep these records. Okay, maybe in towards the end of the projects, he may he may raise it. Okay, or during the project he may raise it, and at least he can recover the cost, the bare minimum cost. But at least yes, he can recover. So with this, we truly appreciate your time, efforts, and expertise you shared with us. And we look forward to have such more enriching sessions in future. With this, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'm very kind of all of you.
Thank you. I will stop the session. Thank you.